Ready to go? Well, good morning, everybody. I think we're ready to go. I trust everybody had a good summer break, if that's what you want to call it. I was down here this week already several times. So what we have today on our docket is we're looking at the 306 Administrative Rules. This is the Legislative Committee for Oversight on Improvement and Assessment. And we've been dealing with the 306 rules here now for a good while, and so has the State Board of Education. And so what we have in front of us today is we have the final proposal on the first portion of the 306s, which was presented to the State Board and acted upon, was it last week?
Yeah, I think so.
Last week, yeah. So what I'd like to do is today take a look at that. We are tasked as the Oversight Committee for Improvement and Assessment to be looking at the academic standards that are set for our state, and to look at it in terms of through the 306s here, to look at those portions which are really reflective of those academic standards. I want to also bring to everybody's attention that we did pass a bill this year which was one which looked at the curriculum frameworks. That was 1107, and that requires the Department of Education to maintain the frameworks, because we had taken frameworks out of law and we put them back in, and the frameworks as they were amended here will reflect and do reflect the academic standards which we have for education. Those academic standards are to be part of the curriculum frameworks. And that was to provide the school districts out in the field the opportunity to really be able to access and find them where they really belong in those frameworks. So with that, I'd like to open up this meeting right here, and we'll look at the 306 is the first portion of that, the August 14 version. If there were some amending language done to that at the State Board that tweaked it in places, I don't have a copy of that. So maybe if folks from the Education Department that are here could let us know that, yes.
Representative Ladd reached out to me for a copy, and what I sent was the posted version that included all of the amendments that were made at the meeting.
Okay, so that's what we have right here in front of us then.
It is as it was approved.
Okay. So then with that, I'd like to open the meeting up to discussing that proposal that was approved by the State Board last week. And so let's take a look, and the first part has some information regarding the information that the department received from the public, and it lists the citizens who submitted public testimony. There's two or three pages of it. And then we will start with our discussion here on page 1 and ask those on the study committee here on page 1, where we're primarily dealing with definitions. And as I recall, in our last June meeting, we looked at definitions, and we, as a committee, indicated that we'd like to see definitions that reflect statutory language rather than having it. And that, I believe, has all been tweaked and all changed within here. So let's walk through it right now. Anything on page 1 of concern?
So, Mr. Chair, just to be clear, we're talking about comments, public comment, correct?
No, I was looking right at the document itself.
Okay, past the public comment, sorry.
Yeah, it'd be of the final proposal, we're looking at page 1, not the front
Okay,
stuff
gotcha.
that had all
All
the
right.
other there.
Thank you.
Yeah. As you may recall, we had the discussion about competencies, the definition of competencies, and now this final proposal or version references RSA 193H:1. and Roman 2. So that is the definition in statute. Is there any other, concerns that the committee may have referencing the academic standards as they relate to these minimum standards for public school approval on that page? Okay, and also the definition for academic standards is that which is in statute. Let's go to page 2.
Well, hang on.
Yeah.
Thanks. So on page 1, where we've got achievement of competencies, which is an area that I think we had some concern back on June 27th, it's now been added through a collection of evidence. Through a collection of evidence. What is that referencing?
In terms of the academic standards?
In terms of achievement of competencies in B, on the third of the last paragraph.
So the definition, you'd have to look at 193H:1, which is the definition for competencies, which is on the top of page 2.
Yeah.
And achievement of competencies, I'm looking at this is how the state board has opted to define achievement of competencies. We're not defining competencies. They're saying, how do we get to that point? Through a collection of evidence. I would assume that's, could be very objective evidence. It could be subjective evidence.
So is that defined?
What, evidence?
Yeah, just collection of evidence. I mean, because we talk about other things in assessment. Are they things that are assessed?
Well, when we've talked about this in the past, about our statewide assessment, from the field, teachers are saying there's lots of different ways of identifying assessment other than the statewide assessment necessarily. And it takes a lot of time out of teaching in our classroom, but we know there's formative, there's diagnostic, assessments.
So an example here is what I'm suggest. I mean, through a collection of evidence. Is the evidence summative assessments? Through, which I think teachers.
Well, it may be more formative too as you're moving through. I would say it's a combination of both, and I don't know.
Formative guides instruction. Summative is the assessment, isn't that? I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but
I think that would be correct. You do formative assessments that's going on to see how these students are progressing and what you might need to present differently or reinforce. And a summative assessment is like a unit test to see if they have grasped the full concept.
Okay.
Because the collection of evidence does not give specific enough guidance to know which of those you're referring to are both acceptable. Is a portfolio, is observational notes. What in this constellation of things you might be using falls under that category.
Right. Thank you. And the reason I'm picking on this, Mr. Chair, is because this was not in the draft that we reviewed on June 27th. So this is new. It's new language, and I'm not clear on what that means.
Is that the responsibility of this committee? That's why I said at the beginning, we're dealing with academic standards.
Yeah.
And is this an academic standard, or is this more in line with how we determine whether the academic standards being?
And I think that's a great question, Mr. Chair, and perhaps rather than going through, all these rules, and I think we do have a time limit today, or time constraint today. that identifying which rules bear on academic standards would be good to understand, and I circulated this around the table, which I think follows on something that you had sent out at the last meeting, and so this, defines the responsibilities of the Legislative Oversight Committee. It defines the process for rule approval, and then it also defines academic standards. And that's the third thing on this page. Means what a student should know and be able to do in the course or at each grade level. And so achievement of competencies means a student has demonstrated competencies at a proficient level through a collection of evidence. Is that an academic standard or is that a non-academic standard? I think is a fair question to put out there, but I think there would be a reasonable argument to make that achievement of competencies means a student has demonstrated competencies at a proficient level through a collection of evidence. So does that mean what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level?
Well,
Achieving a
at a
competency?
proficient level.
Right.
And there's a lot of ways to determine that. As a teacher myself, I oftentimes recognize that the student understood that basic competency by actually going out and functioning, whether it's being applying that skill.
Sure.
Whether it be in music or art or in mathematics. So, when we try to nail this down through a collection of evidence, I interpret that as a wider window for determining how the achievement. And so would that, if we put in a formative and summative, that doesn't even do what I did as a teacher, because I was also looking at how they apply those skills in their career or in their, understanding of that specific competency taught in the fourth grade.
No,
And listening to a parent, the kid's, really progressing.
Okay, so listening to a parent and saying that, if a parent says that the student is competent in something, I don't know if that's how assessment is defined in here. I don't know if there's a reason to merge assessment through a collection of evidence, which is an assessment area, whether that has bearing on achievement of competencies, because I think there's a whole section in here later on assessment.
When you go into our statutes and you're looking at a statewide assessment, it says objective in there. That means it's talking about something such as a norm reference test or something of that nature. But achievement of competencies in terms of a kid that's in a career technical education center, how do you measure a student that's now able to change a tire or put a brake pad on, which is taught in the CTE center?
Yeah. So can we try to find where assessment is?
Even though this is the academic standards are what we identify in 193E2A, right? Those broad learning areas, and then they're further defined within, hopefully in the future, the curriculum, which are in the curriculum frameworks. So I have no problem with the way it's worded right there. As a teacher, I would love that, because through a collection of evidence, it gives me the latitude. And for every competence we have, and if you go to the CTE center, there's a lot of competencies in every course and program. Are we going to have some kind of objective test for everything?
So I that's not what I'm saying, and I think there may be a section in here that applies to CTE. There's certainly a section on page, starting on page 17, that applies to assessment, and I don't know if adding that new language on page 2 through a collection of evidence is something that bears on the assessment part of everything, or I just don't know. It wasn't there in any of the early drafts. And so I'm not quite sure what I mean, can the department comment on the rationale for putting this in?
The department is here today. I think it probably accomplishes what I've been trying to say up here. But is there somebody from the department who would like to speak to? Yeah, come on up, please. You can put 3 chairs up there if you have 3 of you, or are you just going to put your boss up there, huh? Okay.
Thank you. For the record, Frank Blue, Commissioner of Education.
Julie Shea, Administrative Rules Coordinator for the Department of Education.
And so do you just want to explain where you believe this language came from?
Sure. After the initial proposal was submitted, and before or during public comment and before public comment, we met with a group of stakeholders who had changes that they wanted to make to the proposal.
So that group of stakeholders, just to be clear, so included the Superintendents Association, members of the task force, and the Megan Tuttle from the NEA.
And one of the suggested language changes that came through that was adding, through a collection of evidence, to the achievement of competencies. In competency-based learning, that collection of evidence is one of the key factors in determining the achievement of competencies, which can include.
So one of the things, in a lot of the definitions, when we were working through those initial drafts, the definitions were more about process than they were about what the thing was. So initially, the proposal said achievement of competencies means a student has demonstrated competencies at a proficient level. That is achievement of competencies through a collection of evidence, which was requested by the NEA and the NHSAA and other stakeholders in that group, is more process, but we didn't think it harmed the definition. I think that's probably why it's included.
Okay, thanks. I think it's helpful to have these explanations, because this isn't something that we saw on June 27th, and in fact, there wasn't anybody here from the department on June 27th to help us sift through that material. So I appreciate that very much. So then a follow-up question to that, if I might, would be, does that, or I guess, would this part of the rule be characterized as an academic standard?
I think that would be difficult to do. I would say no.
Okay, and why is that?
Because it's not an academic standard, it is a definition of achievement of competencies.
Okay, and the definition of an academic standard is in statute, and I read it out earlier, and that's what you're referring to. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you go to 306.02a, it says academic standards means academic standards as defined in RSA 193E2A 6B.
Correct. Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? We could move on?
I think that's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. You might as well hang loose there if we have some other. Okay, let's get on to page 2 of this. Anything there on page 2? I think a lot of this is similar to the discussion we just had. Curriculum is definitely something we talked about in the past, and that's, of course, defined in RSA 193E2A 6C.
Mr. Chair, what
Yes.
is the red underline, is that new since the February 15th draft, or is that new since?
Yes, so the initial proposal, once that has been submitted, all of those changes are accepted, and then we kind of start with a new draft of, everything's accepted from the initial proposal. So everything that is read here has been added since we received public comment and all that. So this is all new. Yes.
This reflects public comment and GELCAR feedback.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So not everything in let me say it another way. Some of the things that are not in red may still be changes from existing rules.
Yes, that could be, could have been a change in the first draft, but that's since been accepted and it is now part of this proposal and it's not considered new text anymore. But it could be different from what's currently in the rules.
Okay. And when you talk about accepted, I just want to understand.
I'm just talking about track changes, like.
Okay.
accepting
All right.
changes, yeah.
Accepted track change.
Yep.
No, thank you very much.
So, yes, Representative Cordelli.
Thank you. Thank you both for helping us out here. My question was in relation to N, where equity is changed to equitable. But then the last part of it, the term also includes equity. So we're changing equity to equitable, but also referring to equity. So in terms of this, what do we mean by equity?
Yeah, so this definition applies to both equitable and equity.
Okay.
And the reason for the switch was in one of the places where this terminology was used, some grammarians between the state board and the jail car attorneys believed that equitable was the correct grammatical construct and not equity. And so they just asked us to reverse those two definitions. But otherwise, no changes were made in terms of the content of the definitions, because previously it said equity and it had that definition, and it also means equitable, and they just asked us to flip that around because of where the terms were used.
So to follow up on that a little bit, so some of these changes, when you mentioned jail car, have gone through, like, let's say, Attorney Merrill or some of the others over there.
Correct. We were working with Christina and Mike.
Okay, with
So
Christina.
these reflect all of the changes with the OLS attorneys.
Okay, thank you. Not seeing any other hands for page 2 here. Let's move to on forward is, 3 and 4. I was using a yellow marker the other night and I have nothing yellow on those pages.
No, Mr. Chair, sorry. Yeah, I still am on page 2.
Okay,
And where on the rule of 30601 applicability, down at the 30601C references Ed rules 30620 and 30621, and those I believe are those, is that curriculum?
So you might not have the right draft then, because that did get changed at the meeting. And it should say 30621 and 30622, which refers to the K through 8 minimum approval standards and then the graduation requirements.
Okay, so that's not so it's supposed to be 21 and 22
Correct.
on C.
Yes.
And so now if we look at 30621, which I think is on page 19 of the handout, kindergarten through grade 8 school curriculum. So I guess my same question I have before, is 21 and 22 an academic standard? And are 21 and 22 academic standards? And by incorporation into 30601, does 30601 therefore become an academic standard?
Yeah, so they would not be considered academic standards.
So 30621 and 22 are not academic standards?
That's correct.
Now, well, all right, and could you explain the rationale for that?
Because the definition of academic standards is RSA 193E2A-6B, which I can read the definition if you don't have it.
Yeah, I've got it right here. Means what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level.
Right.
So 30621, kindergarten through grade 8 school curriculum.
so I'm on that page too with your page 19 right
Yeah.
at the base.
Yeah,
The local school board shall require that in each school there is an elementary school curriculum, and the curriculum must be aligned with the academic standards, which are reflected in the curriculum frameworks. Maybe it would have been wiser, or not wiser, but, helpful, if we aligned to state academic standards located in the curriculum frameworks that outlines district competencies and going, so making a reference that the curriculum frameworks, and as I mentioned at the very start of this meeting, that I understand the academic standards to be now located properly in the frameworks, which are serve as a guideline for our schools.
Yeah, I mean, so you have the academic standards, and the framework is just the vessel in which those are held.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to understand why 21 and 22 are not academic standards and are not subject to the
So
review
these
and
are
recommendation
these are
of the school.
referencing courses basically.
Yeah.
And academic standards means what a student should know and do. And if you look at those academic standards, it enumerates specifically what a student should be able to know and do. So that's the difference.
So
You can have academic standards in one location and curriculum in another location in the school. And when we look at improvement and assessment, we're measuring whether that curriculum is aligned with the academic standards. We know in some places curriculum is not aligned with the state standards. And so they are separate. You have curriculum, you have instruction, you have assessment. And it's the driver of the whole machine is your academic standard. And so I kind of concur here. The elementary school curriculum it's aligned with those standards, but it's not where you go find those standards. You develop curriculum from your academic standards.
And I think that's clear. Just to comment on that, I mean, exactly right. Like, so the curriculum is not the academic standards.
Right.
You have academic standards, and then the curriculum is teaching content aligned to those standards.
Yeah, you can have U.S. history taught in one school, and the curriculum might not be the same as it is in school district B right next door. But the academic standards have to be reflected in both of those curriculums.
So give me an example of what that would be, Mr. Chair, where the curriculum's different but the academic standard's the same.
Well, we used to have
I mean,
textbook.
can I
Go
weigh in
ahead,
if
go
it's
ahead.
helpful? I mean, like, and a simple example is like we've got our Common Core math and ELA standards. So those are our academic standards, Common Core ELA standards and Common Core mathematics standards. But we have a number of English language arts curriculum used throughout the state. We've got a number of math curricula used throughout the state, which really goes to the very heart of, the education system, which I've shared with this committee before, right? So part of 193E1, Roman numeral 2, school districts then have the responsibility and flexibility in developing diverse educational approaches to instruction and curriculum tailored to meet their students' needs, right? So we're telling them in statute that these are the academic standards, but they are to implement curriculum that aligns to those standards, but they have a lot of latitude and flexibility in implementing a standard that's going to meet the educational needs of their community and their students.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I mean, this I think is exactly what I'm saying. That when you look at Rule 306.21, starting on page 19, and let me take it through page 20 down towards the bottom of 20, the local school board shall distribute instructional time to allow each student to make progression towards proficiency in competency in the following areas. So we're in the section of kindergarten through grade 8 school curriculum, and we're talking about arts education, including music and visual arts, is in there. So why wouldn't that be an academic standard? If an academic standard is what a student should know, arts education, including music and visual arts, and be able to do in a course or at each grade level. Kindergarten through grade 8 school curriculum is the section title for Rule 21, and I think something similar for 20.
Yeah, so with all
why
due
isn't that an academic standard?
So with all due respect, it's a bit of a silly construct. Art is a content area. So if, for example, we just said, and the limit of any input to the local districts was that students should have arts education program, and we didn't provide any academic standards for that, then that would mean that we have not weighed in on what kind of instruction we want the students to be able to understand with respect to arts education. So this is a content area only. It's not a standard.
So content areas.
Learning areas.
Learning areas, content areas. So this goes back to 193E2A that lists all the different content areas, including a couple that were just,
Or the learning areas, because that's the definition in statute, correct? Thank you for correcting me.
in E2A, and we recently added
Well, we put.
personal financial
Personal financial literacy,
and-
yeah, and we juggled it
Genocide
around a little bit.
Holocaust studies was
In
added.
social studies, we added in, yeah.
So isn't that precisely the area that the legislature is looking to protect when it comes to these rules reflecting on making sure that that the rules for our public schools are in fact consistent with these core areas outlined in 193E2A, because the legislature doesn't get into, here is all the curriculum, here's the subject on, Martin Luther King, and here's how you're supposed to teach that, and Abraham Lincoln. We're not getting into that in law. So the academic standards in statute are sufficiently high to be laid out in 193E2A. And that clearly is what the legislature is talking about when it talks about academic standards means what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level. Because the law doesn't specify curriculum. The law doesn't specify, how to, what the cut line is for proficiency. The law doesn't specify that. But it's clear that the law in 193C8, which establishes this committee, 193E2A4, C and D, how this committee actually has a responsibility in the development and recommendation of rules prior to going to the board, and that responsibility is limited to the academic standards that are that clearly are laid out 193E2A in statute, and that anything that's going to be jiggling around how rules that touch on those, that I think it's clear, Mr. Chair, that falls within the purview of this committee to review and recommend, subject to our.
So with all due respect, I think if you look at 4A, it says like the minimum standard for public school approval and the areas identified in paragraph 1.
Where are you now, Mr.
I'm
Commissioner?
in 193E2A.
Okay.
Roman numeral 4A, right?
I don't have
and
that in
essentially,
front of me.
this is where we define an adequate education. And you've defined the legislature has defined the learning areas, of which these are the learning areas. And we have married the language in these rules to the statute for the learning areas. And they're termed learning areas. These are not termed, academic standards. They're in statute. They're called learning areas. Academic standards does show up over onto, as you pointed out, in C, the state board should not amend any existing academic standards. Those and just by virtue of the fact that the statute specifies it, it's clear that this list is not the academic standards. Academic standards are something else. I have arts academic standards in the framework, as Representative Ladd has pointed out.
So let me be. Let me ask the question then. If 306.21 was gutted, I'm not proposing this, but let's just say it was completely hollowed out, that didn't require child development and learning in all domains, physical, social, cognitive, and language, didn't require child-directed experience, movement, creative expression. Remember, we're talking about K-8 through here. Didn't include arts education, music, visual arts, didn't include English language arts and reading, didn't include health and wellness education or physical education or digital literacy or math. I'm literally going down all of the areas in 306.21. And I think there's a parallel in 306.22. Physical education, digital literacy, math, science, social studies, including civics and Holocaust and genocide education. That this could all be hollowed out by the state board, and that wouldn't be subject to this oversight committee. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure I understand the hypothetical question.
No, it's a very clear question. If modification to 306.21 is not subject to this committee, then what you're saying is that the state board could do whatever it wants with 306.21. I'm suggesting that that's not correct.
almost everything in 30621 is actually directly from statute, so it's all,
Yeah,
It-
I mean,
I'm gonna-
and in fact, so this is what we did. There used to be in the previous rule proposal, there were items that were enumerated in this list that were not included in statute and that from previous rule proposals. And the OLS attorneys asked us to remove those because they were not enumerated in statute.
Yeah, and I'm not taking a position opposed to 306.21. I'm just trying to understand why 306.21 or why any changes to 306.21 are not subject to this committee's oversight.
Okay, let me just reference back to what we did last year. And that, I'm looking at the bill, which we had, which was 1107, which dealt with the curriculum frameworks. But that also amended the section of law, which is RSA 186:1. And it got down to Roman 5, and then we looked at A, B, C, and on down. Curriculum is defined there. And curriculum means lessons and academic content taught in school or in a specific course or program. Then D was added. That's the curriculum framework. And I can remember us holding it up because we wanted to get a real good definition for that. It says curriculum framework means an organized plan of study that serves as a guide and reference to what New Hampshire students should know and be able to do in a learning area, and identifies the academic standards aligned with each learning area pursuant to RSA 193E2A1A. So the responsibility for curriculum and curriculum development is totally that of the local school board and instruction as well. But they are required to ensure that that curriculum that they're adopting and approving in that school district is aligned with the academic standards. This is primarily the reason why this was put forward, because we know that may not, in fact, be happening everywhere. And if we're going to have a statewide assessment, which is built around those academic standards, then we want to make sure that instruction, curriculum, and assessment are all aligned so that we're assessing what should be taught. And so, I think we're going in the right direction now, because I'm a total believer that curriculum is a local responsibility. Instruction is also. How you teach something, it's up to the teacher in the classroom and the school district.
We're on the same page,
Yeah,
Mr. Chair,
yeah.
with what you're just saying there. I'm just putting it out that if in the rules that implement the minimum standards for public school approval, if they point to things that are academic standards, such as assessment, what a student should know at a grade level, or content areas, through curriculum frameworks, which clearly implement a curriculum sequence consistent with academic standards. If these rules rely or lean up against the curriculum frameworks, then these rules therefore incorporate academic standard into them. And what I'm suggesting is that if the reliance on those more specific academic standards, such as assessment, such as a curriculum framework, if those were removed, then that would be an issue for this, or those were changed, then that would be an issue, a matter for this committee.
I believe we've even strengthened the process by taking it from rules and putting it in statute. So now we're no longer going to be putting all these things in their individual little groups. And it's a shared responsibility of the state, but it's also so we don't silo curriculum, we don't silo instruction, we don't silo assessment. They're overlapping, but in order for us, and so that there is some direction that this state has, the academic standards have to be made at the state level.
So what does this committee have responsibility over?
Well, we have a responsibility to ensure that the department's not going to change those learning areas without having approval from the general court.
I think that is so I think that's correct. Like you are defining what is an adequate education. So you're enumerating that list, and we've tried in these rules to have fidelity to that list. And then I would point you to the other statute that you referenced, the State Board of Education shall not amend any academic standard. So if we decide to amend an academic standard, shall not approve any new academic standards without prior review and recommendations from this Legislative Oversight Committee. So if we were to come and say to you, we want to modify the arts academic standards, we would come to you for review and recommendation. We would deliberately seek your input with respect to that. But that's not the same as referencing, this here. I think we're conflating two things. Okay,
So basically what I'm hearing you say is if 30621 was hollowed out, I mean, I'm not suggesting it. I'm not suggesting that that's been done. But any changes to 30621 that clearly reference things that are more specific in terms of their academic nature to it, the curriculum frameworks and things like that. If this was changed, wouldn't matter, wouldn't be subject to the review and recommendation of this committee. Is that correct?
Again, I'm not sure I understand the question. If you want to try and clarify that.
So if this committee were to eliminate, not if this committee, if a proposed rule was to eliminate, I'm looking at paragraph H in 306.21, where it talks about social studies, including civics, number one, and number two, Holocaust and genocide education. If you were putting forth a draft rule that eliminated H, that wouldn't be subject to the review of this committee. Is that right?
So again, I prefer not to play hypothetical. We think that this rule proposal has fidelity to the law. Let me just go reference the statute again for us.
I mean, I'm talking about the statute E2A Part 4, Roman 4C. The State Board shall not amend any existing academic standards and shall not approve any new academic standards without the prior, so amend or approve.
Yeah, so again, I don't think that statute applies here because we're not talking about academic standards. I think you would be back on statute Roman numeral 4A as opposed to where you were. And I'm reading, the general court shall periodically, not so frequently, changes made by the Board of Education to the school approval standards referring to the list in 193E2A1, right? So, for example, and so if we change that list, like say the State Board of Education came along and says they want to include, square dancing as a part of an adequate education, not included as an arts program. Like the State Board of Education, I don't believe has the ability to add items to what is required for an adequate education.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, Commissioner. And but again, going back, and I appreciate it's hard to answer hypothetical questions, but if H was removed from 30621, so the part that I just said, social studies including civics and Holocaust and genocide education, if that was removed from 30621, how would the framework or the academic standards then be tethered to the rules for the minimum rules for school approval? How are those even incorporated into the rules for school approval? How could a school be approved if the academic standards are floating over here somewhere without any tether to the rules that are in front of us, the proposed rules that are in front of us?
Well, that's why you have social studies incorporated into the curriculum through grade 8 school curriculum there in ED 30621. Social studies is now mentioned. It's a learning area that you must include in your curriculum in this school.
I get that, but if it were taken out,
So again,
wouldn't
so
that
Representative
be
Luna,
something that's subject to this committee's review and recommendation?
so Representative Luna, I think I don't think it's a logically flawed analogy in the sense that even if the State Board of Education removed that from here, and I'm not sure where we're going with this conversation truthfully, but if they were to remove that, that would not eliminate the requirement for schools to be teaching that. It would eliminate that from this rule, but it remains, social studies remains in statute. The academic standards, remains in statute. Those requirements haven't gone away simply because something has come out of this rule. So I'm not sure I'm not sure where we're going with this conversation.
Yeah. To me, it's connected, and so there's rules that we're looking at in here that I think relate clearly to non-academic areas, and temperature inside a building or something like that. I mean, I don't know, but there's other rules in here that clearly lean on academic minimum standards, and by leaning on an academic an academic standard that's over here, doesn't that also incorporate that academic standard into the rule? That's really what I'm getting at here.
So I guess my question is,
I'm not suggesting that every rule here is subject to the review and recommendation authority of this committee, but I believe that some of them are, and I believe that 20 and 21 and 22 at least are. And the reason we've jumped to 21 and 22 is because they were referred to in 30601, or something like that.
yeah, so I disagree. I think that we have fidelity to the statute in this rule proposal. And so I understand, thank you for explaining kind of the hypothetical model that you're constructing there. But I think that this approach that we have taken has fidelity to the statute.
Okay. Mr. Chair?
Representative.
Yeah.
Were you one?
Just in my thinking, if the state board was to eliminate H, they're not eliminating it from statute. It's in statute. So I don't think it's going to eliminate social studies from our classrooms because it remains in statute.
But you got to remember the purpose behind what we have in front of us. These are the minimum standards for public school approval. If I'm coming from the department, I'm going out and looking at District A here, and they have no social studies being taught in there, and they're not going to get our approval, seeing that it's in these, they're violating basic statute,
Right.
but they're also not complying with the rules for what your curriculum must include.
Right, and I agree with that, Mr. Chair. But the only, so what you the way I interpret what you say is that changes to this rule would be subject to our recommendation. See, what if
If in fact we're here to approve today the minimum standards for public school approval, we're not. We're here to review these in terms of academic standards. Maybe in another week, when September 1, the new law goes into effect, where we're incorporating, the Oversight Committee has the responsibility for minimum standards for public school approval. It might be a different ballgame because then you're looking at everything within the minimum standards for public school approval.
And can I just make one other comment I want to make? So, Representative, I'm more and more understanding kind of what you're talking about here. But if I look at, so I assume you're on page 21 where you're saying take out social studies as an example.
Yeah.
But understand that is qualified. It's embedded in 1, right? And it's embedded in C. And so we're not, by this rule, we're not telling them they have to teach social studies. What we're telling them is the local school board shall distribute instructional time to allow each student to make progression towards proficiency and competencies in the following areas, right? So that's not, we're not like eliminating that. I mean, to Representative Cordelli's point is in eliminating the requirement for social studies that's in the law. And then, for elementary grades 1 through 8, where no middle school has been established by vote of the local school board, these are those areas that we want them distributing instructional time so that students are able to make progress in those areas. So that's what that is saying, right? If I read the rule, that's what's being referenced there. So,
Representative Cordelli.
Yes, isn't this more, for instance, social studies, more process related to the statute? In that we're saying there has to be instructional time for these content areas in middle school, which is reflective of statute. So it's the process of providing instructional time.
yeah, it's operational, correct. I mean, so that, again, that's what this is, that's where social studies is qualified there, so.
Okay, so what you're saying, if I'm understanding that basically the list of the core areas, the learning areas in 193E2A for minimum as the definition of an adequate education, those are what, and I agree with this. These are what every public school has to offer. This breadth of thing doesn't mean that every student has to take world language. Because we don't have a state graduation requirement in world language. Some high schools may have that, but a public school would have to offer the breadth of that. So I guess I'm now thinking that since it's what a school needs to offer as opposed to what a student should learn, then are we saying that there's no coupling of academic standards to a minimum school approval? Because I think if the adequate education is saying that yes, you must offer world language, but it's not required, that we're not actually saying that a student needs to or should be able to, means what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level. We're not saying that there.
Yes, I think you're actually referencing a separate section of the rules under ED 306.22. Is it 22? And it basically says, school districts shall develop competencies based on state academic standards where applicable for all courses of study. School districts may use state model competencies to develop minimal competencies. So I think we're getting there, but the section that you're referencing, I'm not sure that is where is applicable to the conversation that we're having. So I think we all share the same goal. We're trying to help these kids.
I appreciate that, Commissioner. Mr. Chair, Christine Downing, who Chair Klein had leaned on substantially at the board meeting, had her hand up, and I was wondering if.
Christine, is it very, very brief? Because I want to just keep this between the, right here, because we're trying to get through this front half today. Christine, go ahead.
Thank you, Representative Live. Totally will be quick. The only thing I would point out in that language of K through 8 school curriculum, that 21 lead in, is there could be confusion around the phrase that outlines district competencies for grades 1 through 8. Because that phrase itself, that describing phrase, it's not clear. I think the rule is intending on saying there is an elementary school curriculum that outlines district competencies, because in my conversation with the commissioner, it's always been the state establishes the state academic standards, but we're leaving the development of competencies at the district level. But the way it reads, one could interpret that it says, is an elementary school curriculum aligned to state standards that outline district competencies. Someone could read this and say, are the state standards outlining the district competencies? I would caution you about that phrasing because it can open itself. And the other thing I would just point out in the high school conversation is you do have a little bit of a disconnect going in terms of outlining what an adequate education is made up in those learning areas, because you got 2 learning areas in there, logic and rhetoric and personal finance literacy, that have no state academic standards. So when you have a lead-in phrase that says, the local board will, basically establish a curriculum that aligns to state standards, what are you gonna tell your high school folks? Because they don't have state standards in logic and rhetoric and personal finance literacy. So, these are things to think about in the nuances of the implementation. And I just want to end with this one comment. Lots of conversation here about the word curriculum. As a practicing curriculum director, I keep it this simple. Curriculum means these things. It's everything put together. Yes, state academic standards are part of our curriculum process, but a curriculum at a local level does 4 things. One, it tells us what do we want students to know and be able to do. That's our state academic standards. How are we going to measure that student progress? That goes back to that collection of evidence conversation here at the beginning. Third is, what are we going to do for all students, our typical students, so they have learning opportunities and pathways that support those first 2 questions? And then the 4th question, which is where we now build in our intervention systems, is what do we do for those students who aren't making that progress, and how do we intervene? A full curriculum written at a local level, which is why we have that curriculum frameworks now, which is going to get at some more of that beyond just what the state academic standards do for us. That's what a real curriculum implemented at a school level means. So I just wanted to share from a practitioner's point of view, and just some of the wording in here. The friendly amendment I would offer to this lead-in statement might be something like the local school board shall require that in each school there's an elementary school curriculum that outlines district competencies for grade 1 through 8, aligned to state academic standards. So it's very clear where the competencies are coming from, because that's always been a point of confusion in the minimum school approval standards is who's making the competencies? Is it the state or is it the local? That's all I would mention on that.
Further discussion? Okay, I'd like to keep moving along here a little bit. I had a question though on page 7. And I might as well get on with my question right here. It's on page 7, item F. For schools with grades K through 8, the offering of 1 or more world languages, including, are you now saying that we have to have world languages taught in K through 8?
So I believe then there's another spot, and I'm going to wait for Julie to come back up, that it isn't a requirement, but we do
Okay.
know that some of our schools are offering world languages in K-8, and so we're trying to provide guidance with respect to that offering. This is the K-8 world languages.
Yes, so in the previous, or the current rule, I should say, there was language that said if a school is going to offer it through K through 8, they have to have a policy that outlines what that looks
I
like.
get that. I get that.
And so if they're not offering it, then they also say that they're not
For
required
schools
to
with
offer
K
it.
through 8. So you're not saying you need it.
No.
Okay.
And we don't have the authority
It's
to
a
do that.
choice.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. Then I'm good with that. On page 6, I'm rolling back a little bit because we jumped up to the other end there. But on the bottom page 6, it has 30621. Basic learning standards include. Is that? See, we use the word standards a lot. And is it confusing, or are we really trying to say basic teaching in practice and practices include these following things, like homework, promoting students from grade level to grade level, whether you're going to have AP courses or, career related courses, all that is part of the teaching and the implementation of practices, which we include within conveying instruction and curriculum.
We can take that word practices back to the the State Board of Education.
Yeah, because learning standards, okay, now what is a learning standard? Is it all these things which are, boy, I wish we gave more homework in some of our schools. We used to have policies on that for every grade level, so many more minutes are tacked on. That was
That's
the old
exactly what
rule.
this is the policy that the school
Yeah.
board has to have that
Yeah.
outlines what their policy is on homework, what their policy
Yeah,
is
good.
on promoting
Because this
students.
is in the policy section.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. Righty. Okay, we're messing around here in front of these first pages. As long as we're there, I'd like to go to my favorite topic, career technical education. Page 14, 306-16. Okay, item C, right in the middle of the page, CT cooperative agreement shall require the sending and the receiving school districts to coordinate calendars and schedules to maximize students' access to CTE programming pursuant to ED 30. I think it'd be great if you also put in and RSA 188E colon 1 dash A Roman 3, which specifically states what those regional agreements have to have. We put this in the law several.
130402 is actually the rules that specifically talk about the regional career agreements that went through the process last year. So it details.
I know this may be duplicative, but it does do any harm to
We can check
say it
the
again.
Yeah.
And then jumping down to D. I'm getting into things like maintenance of effort, but that's a different topic for today. Every public high school student shall have access to programs at the regional CTE center subject to attainment and of prerequisites and space availability within the program in the CTE center and the sending school budget restriction and the sending school district budget restrictions. We passed in HB 1 and 2 an additional $4 million for tuition and transportation. We did it in a separate grant, seeing that we didn't want to harm the maintenance of agreement that we had. I can remember that discussion with the Senate. But this is just Rick Ladd speaking right now. I understand space availability. That's an issue which we have to do with some of our capital monies. Prerequisites, I understand that. But the latter part within the program in CT and the sending school budget restrictions. This is one of the reasons why we only have 17% of our kids in CTs, because the cost and scheduling and all this other variables. We want more kids there. We want to double this number. So is that last part of the sentence necessary in the sending school budget restrictions? If we're restricting, then it's up to the legislator to do something about that.
Right. I mean, I do understand the issue relative to transportation budget restrictions that may or may not happen. With respect to the $4 million, we've had open grants for reimbursement of tuition for CTE. Only at the last time I checked, was probably about a month or so ago, about $600,000 of that had been applied for.
That's because the other has to be used first before you can apply for it.
Well, this was any time you had, it was retroactive if you had an upside down circumstance is the way that you could get reimbursed for that. So, but there may be, I can't speak to whether there may be other budget restrictions that would affect, that. So
It has nothing to do with academic standards. It's just a flag that I've caught here.
Yep, okay.
That's a Rick Ladd type thing. Seeing I've always been very strong in CT. And the last part under G, part 1, at the bottom of the page there, it says, delivers multi-level career technical education as defined in ED 306 in sequential fashion based on curriculum-specific competencies endorsed by CTE and business leaders. I'm a little confused, and I think I may have said a lot somewhere along the way, Frank, about business leaders. What are...
Yeah, so the way that the CTE program works is for every one of our programs, we have an industry advisory council. And so we do have, for each of our programs, we approve specific program competencies for each of the various things, whether it's automotive or welding or business or whatever it might be. And those are approved both by the CTE centers as well as by the Industry Advisory Council, who provides input and approves those competencies for each program.
So a lot of these competencies which we have in centers right now are based upon industry standard.
Correct. Mostly they are driven by industry standards
Yeah.
because each program is also required to have, an IRC, an industry recognized credential. And so we're trying to align the programs to help the students achieve that, independently recognized, professional credential when they come through the
So would it be
program.
wiser to say instead of business leaders and aligned with industry standard or something language? So we want to align with those standards which business is yelling for us to attain and teach in diesel mechanics.
2 does talk about national industry standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it.
And then also in E, prerequisites shall be directly related to a student's ability to successfully complete the
Okay.
CT program of core technical competencies vetted by business and industry and post-secondary institutions. So, we're leaning in heavily, and we do rely heavily on our industry partners to make sure that the programming that we're setting up is what the industry is looking for.
That's all I had on that page. On 15, I did have one other issue there. 4, where it says implements third-party assessments as recognized and designated by the department. When we have like at the center up in Berlin, when somebody comes in that's a welder, the assessment is based upon the national standard. So are you approving that, or as recognized and designate or approved by the CTE center itself?
So this is dealing specifically with industry recognized credentials, and we've got a rubric for how those are evaluated. There have been instances where we have programs that don't have an industry recognized credential per se, and yet we still do believe that there is a demand for that in the space. And so when that happens, what we do is we basically put together our own industry recognized credential by talking to employers in the area, in the state, and vetting the program standards and competencies with them, saying, hey, kids who come through this program, is this a program that you would be, want to hire a kid out of? And then what we basically do is have those industries those specific businesses that have approved that to put their logo on a certificate so that student, when they graduate, would earn that certificate, and they would be able to take that. We're trying to give them something portable. They could take that to a job interview and say, like, hey, I graduated from a CTE center, and the 5, machining shops in this area have all approved the program that I went through and said that it's a legitimate program and that I've learned the core and the important, aspects of machining.
So the department's engaging in recognizing that machine shop, or?
Correct. So we'll work with them trying to create, like, if
that
I don't
through
have an
Jeff?
industry recognized credential, we'll go create one.
Okay.
To make sure, because again, it could be something that's emerging. E-bikes are coming out. There's not an industry around e-bikes, right? But there's a lot of people who want technicians who are able to work on that type of technology in the growing space. But until the industry catches up with it, we want to make sure that we can continue to give students something that's portable.
Does the committee have any other areas which we want to look at here? Well, we have the crew here. When you're talking about, go ahead.
Go ahead.
On page 17, when you're talking about local assessment and accountability, and on the bottom of the page there you have a 1 and you struck out 2. You talk about local standards. Provides for ongoing assessment of district competencies and graduation requirements through the use of local assessments that are aligned with state. Okay, state and law. I didn't see state on top there. I'm good. Yes, go ahead.
I could just ask again about, back to page 15, at D on the bottom, it talks about confidentiality of information, and it references ED 1119. 1119 would refer to statutory language in that regard, I assume.
Yes, ED 1119 is actually special education, so it refers to confidentiality in that regard.
Okay.
Are there, in looking at this further here, is there any other areas that maybe a committee member here wants to look at? Has there, on page 30, has there been any changes or considerations given by the department? Dina, I want to talk about mathematics just for a second. Of requiring, we require now 3 credits or 3 course, 3 years and 1 year embedded. Math would be embedded in something approved by the local board. Have we thought about, when it comes to mathematics, going from 3 to 4 credits at all?
So I can say that there was substantive conversation about that. And in fact, if you look on the next page, which is the chart that was proposed in the initial proposal,
Yeah.
they had increased that to 3.5 and then added including algebraic concepts and at least a half credit in statistics and data analysis because the board perceived that that was an area of deficiency. Through the public input process, that was reduced back down to 3 credits, but there was certainly a lot of conversation around whether or not we needed to increase that. And where that manifests itself, we see in the post-secondary world where students perhaps have completed their, their math credits by the time they're juniors, so they maybe are not taking any math credits as a senior other than in an embedded type of a way. And as a result of that, when they get to their post-secondary opportunities, be that the community college system or other post-secondary, sometimes they're in need of remedial types of courses because the length of time between those math experiences.
They don't like to call them remedial courses anymore.
I know,
And
co-requisite.
They're embedding
Co-requisite.
on specific skill.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, requisite. And when I was over at NHTI this last week and working with math teachers from out the state on the Math Learning Communities program, there was a lot of chatter about four credits in mathematics to try to move the bubble a little bit in terms of when kids do go to post-secondary education, they're equipped with some of the stuff.
I mean,
skills they need.
relative to these tables, there's quite a bit of conversation at the state board level as well as lots of public input that was all considered as they went through the process.
Okay. Is there any other discussion we have? All my comments I've addressed. Representative Cornell, do you have anything else? Are you with me on the CTE stuff there, Patty? Great, thank you. Okay, Representative Luno?
Sure. On page 22, going into 306.22, the rule with respect to high school curriculum credits and co-curricular programs, where the word course has been deleted several times, and in particular in B, where we talk about on page 22, 306.22, school districts shall develop district competencies as opposed to course competencies based on state academic standards where applicable for all courses of study. School districts may use state model competencies to develop minimum district competencies. So where the word course has been removed there, does that it's clearly used to modify the word competencies, and we also have academic standards in that rule. Would changing that rule relate to essentially amending an academic standard. For example, if you took the word academic standards out of there, would that rule be, would a change to that rule be, be in the purview of this committee to review and recommend? Just saying, if you took the word academic standards out.
I'm not sure I
And-
understand.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, is that rule 306.22b? So what I'm really trying to get at, Commissioner, is what this committee's responsibility is. And if we're just here to provide some feedback and take it or leave it, these are our comments as a legislative committee, then great, there's no authority here. But if this committee has authority to review and recommend, I'm trying to understand where that authority lies, because so far I haven't heard that this committee has any authority to review and recommend. We're just here as legislators providing comment based on what we think should happen, take it or leave it. Trying to understand if there's any authority that this committee has. So in 306.22b, because it references specifically the word academic standards, does this committee have authority to review and recommend? And I'm not saying we wouldn't recommend that change. I'm not saying that. But do we have an authority? Do we have a responsibility to review and recommend 306.22b?
Well, so what I would first start out and just say, irrespective of whether or not you have authority to do this, I think that the department has been and the State Board of Education has been very responsive. We've met with you multiple times, taking your input as public input and as input into this process. And you will see many of the recommendations that were recommended by this body. We took that seriously, and we have incorporated many of those changes. I still, the hypothetical, I'm not sure. How would you read B?
I'm just trying to get away from, is this committee a work group, or is this committee have review and recommendation authority? Because when I read the law, it says we have review and recommendation authority, and that we've got a responsibility in terms of process and sequence in rule approval. And if this is just a work session, then it doesn't say work session in the law. It says review and recommend. And I'm just trying to understand if there's any responsibility that this committee has in the process and sequence of rule approval.
Yeah, so I would reference you to, again, 193E2A, sub 4 sub C, the State Board of Education shall not amend any existing academic standard and shall not approve any new academic standards without the prior review and recommendation of the Legislative Oversight Committee. So I think that very precisely talks about your role with respect to academic standards. And then I had previously referenced as well in 4A where it says changes to the enumerated list of the content areas for an adequate education. It says changes made by the State Board of Education to the school approval standards through rulemaking effective date of this section shall not be included within the standards until they constitute an opportunity for delivering an adequate education without prior adoption, which would require the entire general court. So those are the two things that I would point to. Did I miss something? You were referring to courses taking out of there, and I didn't know if that was germane to your question.
It was a change that has been proposed by the department in a rule that clearly talks about academic standards. So I just sort of picked up on a rule that uses the word academic standards and a change, an amendment. Because it says shall not amend or approve any new academic standards.
Yeah, so these would not be new academic standards. So
Okay, so even a rule that refers to academic standards isn't subject to this.
they would not. They are not academic standards. This is not an academic standard.
Oh, okay, and even a rule that refers to an academic standard would therefore not be subject to this committee.
Again, I believe that we've followed the appropriate process and have fidelity to the statute in terms of the rulemaking process that we followed here.
Okay, thank you.
Is this the perspective you've gotten from the Jelcar attorneys?
We have worked very closely with them in this process.
Yes, Representative Cordelli.
Yes, I was just looking on page 33, 30625. Is this in relation to RSA 194E and innovation schools?
This rule predates the statute of innovation rules, so there's always been a process where if there was something that they needed alternative approval for, this would be the process for it.
Okay.
And I guess I'll just point out there is a separate rule that has been adopted by the legislature for the innovation school statute.
Thank you.
Well, with the introduction of the legislation we put forth, where the academic standards will be reflected in the frameworks, that's where they are. And you're referencing the areas of learning within these 306s. And we've also addressed the issue that we were concerned initially with definitions, and those have been all been corrected to reference the RSAs. I guess I'm at the point where on this portion of 306s, I have nothing further to really offer you at this time, other than, you know, it seems like we've got this thing in hand, especially with the House bill which we put forward. Now we also have on 1107, but we also have the other bill coming forward, where change coming. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out. That's one that gives this study committee the authority to make recommendation on all the minimum standards. I kind of look forward to it. You know, I know you probably don't look forward to us doing that, but I'm really been, I see some districts where you have to have how many credits to get out of school? 24 or so, or 22?
I'm 27.
Yeah, okay, wow. And some that are offering 20 to get out, and those graduation competencies developed at the local level. So those areas which I'd like to dig into sometime along the way here.
Thank you.
Yeah, are there any other comments before we, take the leash off?
I just wanted to
Yeah.
get over to 306.26.
30626. That's where Representative Cordelli was. You were 25?
So I'm over on 20.
State board, establishment of state academic standards, okay.
State Board Establishment of State Academic
yeah,
Standards. So, and I apologize, Mr. Chair, because I'm working from both the
old and the new?
the old and the new,
Yeah.
exactly. So I'm looking at the side-by-side that Jennifer Four prepared based on the February draft. And so I'm on page 43 of the side-by-side. Do you have the side-by-side?
No, I don't have the side-by-side with me today,
So-
so why don't you read what we've got there?
So the side-by-side is helpful because the side-by-side shows how 306.26, State Board Establishment of State Academic Standards, has removed references to Ed 306.31 relative to art education, .37 relative to English language arts, .40 relative to health education, .41 relative to physical education, 42 relative to digital literacy, 43 relative to math, 45 relative to science, 46 relative to social studies program, 49 relative to Holocaust and genocide education. And that's at the, for grades 1 through 8, where no middle school has been established. And then it continues on in a very similar vein with those same references for middle school and so those references have been removed. So these are the cross references that are clearly pointing to academic standards. So does this goes right back to the same? And I'm sorry to be Groundhog Day here, but is Ed 306.26 subject to the review and recommendation of this committee, given the content?
I think you're referring to an old number because the current 30626 doesn't remove anything. It's all new language.
Yeah, see, that's hard to, it's hard to tell because we don't have the difference between this and the current rules. It's only this and the earlier draft.
Right.
And so let me make sure it's 26. So 26 is, all right, so this is now Ed 20, 306.20. I mean, I'm now looking at the side-by-side. Used to be 306.26, it's now 306.20. And so kindergarten, grade 8, through grade 8 school curriculum. And it's,
The numbers have changed.
if it's changed again, I couldn't tell you. So, yeah, so we already talked about 2.
Yeah, we
so
did.
I'm not trying to
Yeah.
go there again. But what I didn't see when we talked about it earlier, when we talked about 2.1 earlier, was because I think I was referring to today's handout, and let me just try to get back over to it. Today's handout on 306.21 doesn't show that for element, for instance, geez, this is hard. I'm sorry. It's painful to go through. That the current rule in 2.1 or wherever it is, in current law, in current rules, for elementary grades 1 through 8, where no middle school has been established by vote of the local school board, the school board shall adopt for each school a local time schedule specifies the distribution of instructional time among the following learning areas to be taught in grades 1 through 8 at all learning levels in the school. Ed 306.31, 37, 40, 41, 42, all the things that I just talked about. So all of those cross-references have been eliminated. Mr. Chair, is this subject, are cross-references, specific rule cross-references to academic standards, is this subject to this committee's review and recommendation?
And it's cross-referencing, you say, to academic standards that are where?
That are in rules 306.31 through 49. There, and it may not be.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to
There may
point
be
back,
more to
I'll
it.
point back to the statute as well. The state board shall not amend an existing academic standard. So this
Yeah.
is not amending any
Yeah,
existing
so if it
academic
refers,
standards.
if essentially the rule is providing a tether to an academic standard and that tether is cut, then that's not amending the academic standards. It's just simply setting the academic standard free from implementation.
We have not amended any academic standards.
No, I understand that. But if you set an academic standard free from implementation, if the implementation is the local school board shall adopt for each school a local time schedule which specifies the distribution of instructional time among the following learning areas to be taught in grades 1 through 8 at all learning levels in the school, and it lists all of these academic standards, and you're not changing the academic standards, you're just changing the fact that you're just changing the implementation of those academic standards at the local level, that's not actually modifying an academic standard. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
So what I'm telling you is that we've not modified any academic standards in this
Right.
rule.
You're just untethering it from implementation, so that they're just floating over here.
Yeah, we've not modified any academic standards.
I understand. So would those academic standards still apply in the rule that I'm talking about?
So
306.21?
Yeah, so academic standards continue to apply, and we've got academic standards that the State Board of Education has adopted, and those are on our website.
How do they continue to apply in 306.21?
Because you're required, I mean, if I go back to the section in G where it talks about the requirement to have academic standards that align to the state standards that then model district competencies. So there's a number of other places in this rule body where those are interconnected.
Could you
No. Okay.
could you point out where standards 31 through 49, the 306.31 through 49, and there's some numbers missing in there. Could you talk about could you show us in the minimum standards for school approval, the proposed minimum standards for school approval, where those academic standards are being referenced, that a school that does not implement those academic standards would fail to meet the requirement for minimum school approval?
Isn't this why we just did 1107 though? The academic standards are now located in the curriculum frameworks. And we mentioned curriculum here, but your curriculum has to be aligned with those academic standards.
I'm just trying to see where it's tethered to the rules for implementation. I mean, do you see what I'm saying, Mr. Chair? I'm sorry.
The implementation is done through your instruction and your adopted curriculum in the school.
Right. So
But
where's
your academic standard, though, is immersed into that curriculum, and in practices through your instruction are there as well when you talk about homework or some of those other areas. So I guess I would ask, are you really looking to see the academic standards, everything that's in those frameworks, service guidelines, and I've asked the question many times before, where do I find the academic standards? I've asked that for years here.
On my
I've
website.
asked it last year.
On my website.
On their website. And I've been told the academic standards are located in the basically curriculum frameworks for each of those learning areas.
all right. So
Do we need to duplicate that in 306 if it's already referenced over there in the frameworks?
all right. So let me put the question out there, because this is beyond the first half. So 306.31 relative to an arts education, is that an academic standard?
So what I would tell you is school districts, and representing your question, we looked at this section before, it's in 306.22. School districts shall develop district competencies based on state academic standards where applicable for all courses of study. School districts may use state model competencies to develop minimum district competencies.
So thank you. So is what we're in right now is I think we were back to 306.21, which the earlier draft had eliminated, and I didn't, sorry for not picking it up earlier because it wasn't contained in what was handed out today. The earlier draft had eliminated from 306.21 had eliminated a reference to 306.31 relative to an arts education. So my question to you, Commissioner, is 306.31 an academic standard?
So what I would tell you is that is referring to academic standards that are on the department's website at this point.
So is that a yes, that 306.31 is an academic standard?
I don't have those with me, so I'm not prepared to speak to those.
Okay, so, all right, so just for the purpose of...
Because I believe there's a separate rule proposal, the back half is coming, and we're not here to talk to those at this point in time.
I understand. Just for the purpose of discussion, though, if 306.31 relative to an arts education, if that is an academic standard, would eliminating the cross-reference to that academic standard be from the minimum standards for school approval. Would that mean that a public school could be approved without providing an arts education?
So if it were an academic standard, again, pointing back to the statute, the State Board of Education shall not amend any existing academic standards. And this proposal in front of you does not amend any existing academic standards.
Right, we're talking past each other, Commissioner. What I'm talking about is when you take an academic standard and it's tethered to an implementation. So the implementation in the existing Rule 30621, if that's still the same number, is the local school board shall adopt for each school a local time schedule which specifies the distribution of instructional time among the following learning areas to be taught in grades 1 through 8 at all learning levels in the school. And this is where it talks about 306.31 relative to an arts education, 37 relative to English language arts. If all of those things are taken out, how are those academic standards then incorporated into the standards for the minimum standards for school approval?
So I'll talk process here for a moment. So the reason those numbers were taken out is because, so we split this into two proposals. There was a lot of renumbering because we added some sections, we removed some sections, there were sections that were reserved. So the numbering, as you can see as we've been going through it, has changed significantly. And that includes the numbers in the other half that we haven't yet addressed. Those numbers are going to change. And regardless of the content in those areas, they are still part of the rules. And so they have to be followed.
Right, they haven't gone away. They're still live. There are actual rules that are in place. But,
I just don't know what the numbers
but what I would tell you is that changing a reference to an academic standards, it does not constitute as enumerated in statute, an amendment to an existing standards, right?
Okay, so I just
changing a reference to a standard is not changing a standard.
Okay, no, fair enough. I'm wondering obviously what the legislative intent was, when the legislature created 193E2A Roman for C and D. But regardless of that, what you just read off with respect to academic standards is actually the language in the law. So what I want to get at is if you take out all those cross references, 306.31 relative to arts education, 37 relative to language arts, does a local school board need to provide a local time schedule that specifies the distribution of instructional time among the following learning areas? Does the school board have to do anything to provide instruction in those for those academic standards?
He's on 21.
Do they need to be compliant with the academic standards
So
in order to be approved?
Several questions there. So I'm going to
Yeah.
start with the first one, which I was trying to understand, trying to find a place where you are there. So again, it says in 306.21, right? So the rule as adopted will state that the local school board shall distribute instructional time to allow each student to make progression toward proficiency and competencies in the following areas, and it enumerates those areas. So that is a requirement that a local school distribute their time to be able to offer that instruction. And then I would point you again back to over on page 22, where it says school districts shall develop competencies based on state academic standards, right? So all of those standards that have been adopted where applicable for all courses of study.
Can I just ask?
So there, that's how, see, just to finalize this question. So it says right there that school districts shall develop competencies based on state academic standards where applicable for all courses of study. So if art is a course of study, then you shall have competencies that are based on state academic standards.
Representative Cornell?
Yes, on page 20 where it says the local school board shall distribute instructional time. Is there a definition for instructional time? Is that a class?
It's defined.
I missed it.
Instruction is defined, so.
Instructional time is also defined in all on page 2. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, and thank Representative Cornell for that question with regards to instructional time. Does that instructional time have to be consistent with the academic standards in each of these areas? And I'm looking at on the bottom of page 20 from today's handout, where you've got C1A, for instance, arts education, including music and visual arts.
So what is the question?
So C1A requires the local school board shall distribute instructional time to allow each student to make a progression towards proficiency in competencies in the following areas.
All right.
And so A is arts education, including music and visual arts. So does that instructional time that the school board has to provide, is that consistent with, does that have to be consistent with an academic standard?
Yeah, so the academic standards are not defining how much instructional time. They are not connected to the instructional time.
That changed. You know, we once had in all the New England states, we had specific minutes per week where you must teach history or you must teach science. Then we came along with thematic reading and everything else, and they're saying, well, I'm teaching social studies by way of this thematic reading program in my reading time. So I'm covering 2 subjects at one time, less minutes. We got away from that. What we were primarily interested in the issue of time is how much that time is engaged time, time in which instruction's actually occurring, or is it time that's just, well, the clock started at 9 o'clock, it's now 9:45, we've had our time. Well, how much does that really engage time? Maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes out of that whole time. So that's an instructional methodology that it comes underneath a different bailiwick, which, you know, it's a supervisory issue, it's a teacher issue to use time wisely.
I mean, and it's also a flexibility issue for a
Yeah.
local district to
Yeah.
make determinations in terms of the allocation of their time, because they're going to have different cohorts of student. And what we're saying is that we want to allocate the time so that students make progression towards proficiency. And so that may look different for different students, for different schools.
And would that proficiency have to be towards the academic standard listed out in 306.31 for an arts education program?
They would be proficient in the competencies as is enumerated there that the local school district has adopted. Remember, that was that thing that I just read you out of B on the following page.
Right. So what they adopt, does that have to be compliant with an academic standard?
So what it says is that they have to be based on the state's academic standards. But again, Representative Luno, and it seems like we're going around in circles here a bit, we don't perceive that is an amendment to an existing academic standards again. So I'll just continue to focus on that.
Yeah, so we're
I was reading the statute,
which statute were you reading?
the one that we continue to
Yeah,
refer to in
yeah.
193C. It
Yeah.
says the state board shall not amend
Right.
any existing academic standards.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Right. So even where an academic standard is being used to guide or to require a school board to do something, providing instructional time to meet an academic standard, where that academic standard is no longer being referenced in that rule. How does the school board know what to do? Number one. And number two, how does the State Board of Education know if a school should be approved?
again, so you have referenced they're using the state academic standards. I certainly hope that they are using those standards because we want them to do that. That is the purpose. Use of a standard would not constitute an amendment to a standard.
Right, even when it's taken out of implementation. I mean, I honestly, my background's engineering, so when you don't refer to a technical reference, eliminating that technical reference is the same thing as changing that technical reference.
So the technical reference hasn't changed.
Because it untethers from the implementation. I mean, so I'm sorry if if I'm looking at this process as in a much more rigorous way than maybe how the department interprets it. But I have a hard time believing that the legislature would feel good with modifying rules, amending rules to relieve school boards from following academic standards. Because
So that would be, just to be clear, like, and I want to make sure this is on the record, that's an incorrect characterization, and I will read again to you. 306.22B, school districts shall develop competencies based on state academic standards where applicable for all courses of study. The state board, the public who has provided extensive input into these rules has not, untethered the education for these students. It is clear in this rule proposal.
Are you there?
I'm done.
Good. Any further comments from the committee at this time? I want to thank you very much for coming today and helping us out with this. Now, this is the front side. When's the back side going to be taken up?
Begin working on that.
Okay. Thank you. How many versions are you going to have? There you go. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.
So ready as the committee right now, so on this front side, other than what we've discussed here, I don't have any other recommendations to make.
Yeah, I see the role as this committee as not being sort of like a recommendation work group. I see it as having responsibility and review and recommendation authority as part of the process. And
In terms of the academic standards, I could make a recommendation right now saying, I don't see the academic standards being changed. I see them continuing. And so.
That's part two.
And then we look at part two and see where we are with that. And then we will have, of course, more ability to look at all minimum standards in that part two.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but from a sort of a process standpoint or actually from a I mean, I'm making a technical argument here that when a rule references another rule, that cross-reference to another rule is in fact a technical standard, then that becomes incorporated into the rule that was using it. And I certainly understand that in the areas that we talked about, no, if Ed 306.31 relative in arts education is, and I'm looking at it right here, so it's I don't know, 1.25 page, 1.25 pages long, that you would just cross-reference it. You wouldn't actually copy and paste all those words into it. You'd cross-reference it. And the reason it was cross-referenced, because it was actually saying the school board needs to do something with this academic, to follow this academic standard. And by taking out the cross-reference, you're essentially taking out the language from that cross-reference that was incorporated by reference into the rule. And I think it's a very fair way of both, making it easier to reference.
I think what we're trying to do is
and also being rigorous.
Getting academic standards located in one place, getting them clarified is important. I can remember going back to July 1, 2015, when I sat on GELCAR. And there was a proposed rule change. Of course, the department missed the deadline. And so 306.311 didn't go forward. And that was more than 1.5 pages. I believe when you're talking about art and the health and some of those other areas, it became almost 3 pages. And it was turning into the 306s becoming the academic standards. and it's very confusing. And I think that confusion has now been eliminated through what we did. What we need to do now is make sure those curriculum frameworks are updated, make sure the curriculum frameworks reflect those academic standards that we are wanting, because I think that's the key to having a successful curriculum instruction in our local schools. If we have those all aligned and aligned with our statewide assessment, we want that assessment assessing what we're supposedly teaching. And so I think we're on the right track here. It's going to take a little bit to get this thing all in line, but I think we're moving it very, very quickly here. And I mean, in terms of what we are directing, we believe academic standards are extremely important as a state. And that's why we need to look at those frameworks, which are the academic standards. I'd like to see some clarity within the frameworks as far as the specific academic standards. And then, because the rest of it's guidelines in terms of how you might teach economics or whatever, and what you might incorporate into it in terms of content and skills. But I'm good with the 306 is the way we are, because I don't think we're cutting anything out. I think we're referencing it in the proper space now.
Yeah, I disagree on that, but
Yeah. It's okay to disagree. Yeah, we'll walk out of here shaking hands still.
yeah, no worries about that.
Okay, good enough. So it is lunchtime, and we have another meeting starting up in another hour, some of us. So with that, we'll close this Education Study Committee, and we look forward to the second half. Thank you.